Between August 12th and 14th, 1978, 14 people perished in a barn fire in McLean County, Illinois, in what would become known as the Henley Farm Massacre. All adults, all seasonal agricultural workers hired for the corn harvest. The method was arson, deliberate, calculated, and executed with chilling precision. The perpetrators weren't rival farmers or criminal gangs. They were three brothers from one of the county's oldest farming families, Robert, James, and Thomas Henley, ages 52, 48, and 45, who'd worked the same land their great-grandfather had claimed in 1878. The Illinois State Police would later call it one of the most calculated mass murders in Midwest agricultural history. But the motive wasn't insurance fraud, wasn't a labor dispute over wages, wasn't even personal hatred. It was 400 acres of destroyed seed corn, ruined by what the brothers believed was deliberate sabotage, threatening to erase 100 years of family legacy in a single season. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. McLean County, Illinois, stretched across 1,184 square miles of some of the flattest, most fertile land in North America in 1978. The county sat in the heart of the state, roughly 90 miles southwest of Chicago, home to approximately 120,000 people scattered across small towns and isolated farmsteads. The county seat, Bloomington, held about 45,000 souls. The rest lived in places with names like Lexington, Chenoa, and Downs, communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, everyone's debts, and everyone's breaking points. August in central Illinois meant temperatures climbing to 85 degrees by afternoon, humidity so thick you could wring water from the air, nights dropping only to 65 if you were lucky. The landscape was corn, nothing but corn in every direction, green walls 8 feet tall stretching to horizons so distant you could watch weather systems form 20 miles away. The smell was diesel exhaust from tractors running 18-hour days, fertilizer with its sharp ammonia bite, and that particular sweet rot scent of corn silk drying in August heat. At night, when combines finally stopped, you could hear cicadas screaming from every tree, the rustle of corn leaves moving in whatever breeze managed to find its way across the flatlands, and the distant rumble of grain trucks heading to elevators in town. But 1978 was a dangerous year for family farmers in McLean County. The agricultural economy that had sustained these communities for a century was beginning to crack in ways nobody wanted to acknowledge. Inflation hit 9% nationally. Interest rates were climbing toward levels that would eventually reach 21% by 1980. The land boom of the early 70s, when farmland prices had doubled in some areas, was starting to reverse. Banks that had encouraged farmers to expand, to borrow against inflated land values, to modernize their operations, were suddenly nervous about the loans they'd written. Foreclosures were starting, just a trickle in 78, but everyone could feel what was coming. The great farm crisis that would devastate rural America throughout the 80s was beginning its slow, brutal arrival. In McLean County, where corn was king and had been since the prairie was first broken by steel plows in the 1850s, farmers lived and died by their corn yields. This wasn't just agriculture. It was identity, legacy, proof that hard work and knowledge of land and weather could provide security in an uncertain world. Most farms had been in the same families for 3, 4, sometimes 5 generations. Your great-grandfather had claimed the land. Your grandfather had survived the Depression by farming it. Your father had mechanized and expanded. Now you were trying to hold on to it while economic forces you couldn't control ground away at everything you'd inherited. McLean County produced more corn per square mile than almost anywhere on Earth. The soil, deep black loam deposited by glaciers 10,000 years ago, was perfect for corn. No rocks, no hills, just flat, rich earth that could grow 200 bushels per acre in a bad year, 240 in a good one. But by the 70s, farming had become expensive. A new combine costs $60,000. A 4-wheel drive tractor ran $45,000. Land prices ranged from $2,000 to $3,000 per acre. Fertilizer, seed, fuel, chemicals, all rising in cost every year. To make money, you needed scale, you needed perfect weather, you needed perfect execution, and increasingly, you needed hired help because farms had grown too large for families to work alone. That's where migrant workers came in. Every summer, crews of men traveled north from Texas and Mexico, following the harvest from Oklahoma wheat fields to Illinois corn, ending in Wisconsin cranberry bogs by October. They worked hard, demanded little, sent most of their pay home to families in places where $100 meant the difference between eating and hunger. The Henley farm sat 7 miles northeast of Lexington, Illinois, on land that stretched from Route 150 north to the Mackinac River bottoms. 850 acres. All corn except for 30 acres around the house and outbuildings. The original homestead had been claimed by Ezra Henley in 1878, a Union Army veteran who'd walked away from the Civil War with a limp and determination to never be poor again. He'd built the first house from prairie sod, lived in it for 3 years, while he broke the virgin prairie with a team of oxen and a steel plow that weighed more than he did. By 1885, Ezra had a proper house, a barn, 200 acres under cultivation, and a reputation as a man who paid his debts and kept his word. His son, Robert Sr., had expanded the farm to 400 acres by 1920, survived the Depression by grinding wheat for neighbors when their crops failed, served on the county draft board during World War II, sending other men's sons to war, while his own son, Robert Jr., was too young to serve. Robert Jr. took over in 1952, expanded to 600 acres, bought the first combine the farm had ever owned, married Betty Ann Morrison in 1953. They had 4 children, 3 boys and a girl. The boys, Robert III, James, and Thomas, grew up understanding that the farm was more than dirt and equipment. It was the family name, written across the landscape in straight rows and clean fields. It was their great-grandfather's dream, made real through 100 years of sunrise to sunset labor. By 1978, the 3 Henley brothers had been running the farm together for 3 years, since their father's death from a heart attack in '75. They'd inherited the operation jointly, 850 acres free and clear, plus equipment and a modest savings account. But they'd immediately borrowed $300,000 to expand, buying adjacent property and new equipment. The plan was simple: increase production, specialize in premium seed corn under contract with DeKalb Ag Research, and ride the agricultural boom everyone said would last forever. Premium seed corn paid double what regular corn brought. DeKalb contracted for specific genetics, required careful isolation from other corn varieties, demanded near-perfect germination rates. The brothers had signed a 5-year contract in '76. First 2 years had been successful enough. Not spectacular, but solid. Enough to make payments, support 3 families, believe the gamble would pay off. Then '78 arrived, with its perfect weather, its ideal growing conditions, and its promise of the best crop the brothers had ever produced. $480,000 worth of seed corn if everything went right. Enough to pay down substantial debt. Enough to prove they'd made the right decisions. Enough to ensure the Henley name would remain on this land for another generation. Robert Allen Henley was 52 years old that August, though his body carried the wear of 60. He stood 6 feet exactly, 190 pounds, with shoulders broad from decades of throwing hay bales and wrestling steering wheels on tractors without power steering. His face was weathered like wood left too long in sun and wind, deep creases around his eyes from squinting into fields, around his mouth from years of setting his jaw against whatever came. His hands were huge, knuckles swollen from old breaks that had never been properly set. Calluses so thick on his palms he could pick up hot metal without flinching. A scar ran along his left shoulder. Souvenir from Korea, where he'd served with the 1st Marine Division from 1951 to '53. Shrapnel from a Chinese mortar had torn through his shoulder at the punch bowl, missed the bone by a 1/4 inch. Doctors said he was lucky. Robert never felt lucky about Korea, just felt like he'd survived when others hadn't, which created its own kind of debt. Every morning, Robert woke at 4:45 exactly. Didn't need an alarm. His body knew when darkness was about to break. He'd make coffee in a percolator his wife Linda had bought in 1965, the kind that gurgled and hissed and produced coffee strong enough to strip paint. He'd drink it black, standing at the kitchen window, watching for the first hint of light over the eastern fields. By 5:15, he'd be outside, walking the property, checking irrigation lines, looking for problems before they became disasters. He'd married Linda Sue Patterson in 1950, right after his discharge. She'd waited for him through 2 years of war, writing letters every week, sending care packages of cookies and hand warmers and photos of home. They'd had 3 daughters. Sarah was 26 now, married to a machinist in Bloomington, 2 kids of her own. Rebecca was 24, teaching 2nd grade in Chinoa. Michelle was 21, still living at home, working at the county extension office. No sons, which meant the Henley name would die with Robert's generation unless one of James's or Thomas's boys took it on. That thought gnawed at Robert more than he'd admit. What Robert valued most wasn't money, though God knew they needed it with the debt they carried. What he valued was legacy. This land, these fields, this name. His great-grandfather had walked away from the Civil War, and built something from nothing, had literally carved civilization from prairie grass using muscle and will. Every generation since had added to it, improved it, passed it forward. Robert intended to do the same, to hand his brother's sons, his nephews, something worth keeping. The farm wasn't just property. It was proof that the Henley family mattered, that they'd left a mark on the world that would outlast them. It was identity made visible. Without it, they were just men. With it, they were part of something larger than their own brief lives. That distinction meant everything. James Edward Henley, 48 that summer, was the technical brother. Where Robert understood land and weather, James understood machines. He stood 5'11", built stocky and powerful, from years of crawling under equipment, wrestling with hydraulic lines, rebuilding engines in the barn. His hands were always stained with grease no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. A thick scar crossed his right forearm, souvenir from a corn picker that had grabbed his sleeve in '69. He'd pulled free, but not before the machine had opened his arm from wrist to elbow. 112 stitches, 3 months before he could use the hand properly again. James had never married, lived in a small house on the property's northwest corner, spent most of his free time reading equipment manuals and agricultural engineering journals. His brothers joked he could diagnose a tractor problem by listening to the engine from 100 yards away. It wasn't entirely a joke. James had an almost supernatural connection to machinery, could feel when something was about to fail, could coax extra life from equipment that should have been replaced years ago. Thomas Robert Henley, the youngest at 45, was the business mind. He handled sales, contracts, banking relationships, everything that happened off the farm. He stood 6'1", lean and hard, with a face that smiled easy, but eyes that calculated constantly. Thomas had married Mary Catherine Wilson in '68. They had 2 sons, Robert James, 16, and Michael Thomas, 14. Both boys worked the farm every summer, learning what their father and uncles knew, preparing to inherit what came next. The 3 brothers had operated the farm as equal partners since their father's death. No formal legal structure, just an understanding that everything was shared, every decision required consensus, every burden was carried jointly. They met most mornings at 5:30 in Robert's kitchen, drank coffee, planned the day, addressed problems before they grew into catastrophes. They rarely argued. They'd spent their entire lives working together, learning each other's strengths, compensating for each other's weaknesses. Robert provided vision and connection to legacy. James provided mechanical expertise and practical problem solving. Thomas provided business acumen and relationships with the outside world. Together, they were a complete unit, more effective than any one of them could be alone. They'd made the decision to borrow and expand together. They'd signed the DeKalb contract together. They'd bet the farm's future together. And in August of 1978, they'd watch their careful plans disintegrate together, destroyed by what they believed was deliberate sabotage by the very men they'd hired to help secure their future. The farm employed 14 seasonal workers that summer, hired through a labor contractor based in Texas. 8 Mexican nationals, mostly from Jalisco State, plus 6 local men who needed summer work between other jobs. The arrangement was standard for large-scale corn operations. The contractor guaranteed workers would arrive on schedule, work hard, cause no problems. The farm provided basic housing in a converted barn, paid competitive wages, treated workers fairly. It had worked for 3 seasons without significant issues. The 78 crew had arrived in late May, started work preparing fields, continued through planting, cultivation, and now stood ready for harvest. They lived in the East Barn, a structure built in 1932, solid post and beam construction, converted to bunkhouse with beds, electricity, a bathroom, basic kitchen facilities. Not luxurious, but adequate. Better than many seasonal workers experienced. Miguel Ángel Ruiz was 34 years old that August, the crew leader, the man who spoke English well enough to translate, who kept track of hours, who mediated disputes between workers and bosses. He stood 5'8", 160 pounds, with hands that had been picking crops since he was 9 years old. He came from a village outside Guadalajara, Jalisco, where his wife Rosa and 3 children, ages 12, 9, and 6, waited for the money he sent home every 2 weeks. $200 per wire transfer, enough to pay rent, buy food, keep his oldest daughter in school. Miguel had been working American harvests for 16 years, following the seasons from Texas cotton to Illinois corn to Wisconsin vegetables. He knew how to work hard, how to stay invisible, how to avoid trouble. He sent Christmas cards to the Henley brothers every December, thanking them for fair treatment. He planned to work 2 more seasons, save enough to buy a small store back home, retire from the migrant circuit before his body gave out completely. David Lee Parker was 19, the youngest worker, local boy from Lexington trying to save money for Illinois State University. He'd been accepted to study agriculture, planned to become a county extension agent, help farmers like the Henleys modernize their operations. He stood 6'2", skinny as a fence post, with sandy hair and a smile that made older workers protective of him. His parents, William and Dorothy Parker, ran a hardware store in town. They'd raised David to believe education was the path out of small-town limitations, that hard work and planning could build a future. David worked the Henley farm to prove he understood agriculture from the ground up, not just from textbooks. Carlos Mendoza, 41, had worked 17 American harvest seasons, married, 5 children in Mexico, sending every dollar home except what he needed for food and cigarettes. Roberto Sanchez, 28, single, planning to use his savings to buy land in Michoacan. Jesus Hernandez, 36, whose wife had died the previous winter, working to support his aging parents. Francisco Torres, 24, newest to the crew, learning the work from Miguel. Antonio Delgado, 39, quiet man who read Bible every night before sleeping. Jose Martinez, 27, fastest worker on the crew, dreaming of opening a mechanic shop back home. Raul Gutierrez, 32, supporting his brother's family after his brother had been killed in a tractor accident. Pedro Castillo, 29, engaged to be married in November, showing everyone photos of his fiancée. The local workers included Terry Jameson, 23, laid off from the Caterpillar plant in Bloomington, hoping factory work would return. Mark Sullivan, 26, Vietnam veteran trying to readjust to civilian life, finding peace in agricultural work's repetitive nature. Kevin Richards, 22, working 3 jobs to support a young wife and infant daughter. Daniel Whitmore, 28, mechanic whose shop had closed, desperate for any income. Christopher Hayes, 25, former coal miner from southern Illinois, displaced when mines mechanized. James Morrison, 27, recently divorced, sending child support payments to a wife in Peoria. 14 men, 14 lives, 14 sets of hopes that extended beyond the Henley Farm's boundaries. They weren't statistics. They weren't interchangeable labor units. They were humans with families, with dreams, with futures they expected to reach. They worked hard because that's what work required. They slept in the converted barn because that's what the job provided. They trusted that fair treatment would be reciprocated with fair wages, that mistakes would be corrected, that problems would be solved through communication rather than conflict. The 1978 corn crop represented everything the Henley brothers had wagered on their collective future. 400 acres of premium seed corn, DeKalb genetics specifically bred for disease resistance and high germination rates. The contract specified that if seed corn met quality standards, testing above 95% germination, DeKalb would pay $960 per acre. 400 acres times $960 equaled $384,000 gross revenue. Subtract production costs, roughly $190 per acre, left approximately $308,000 net. Split 3 ways, that was $102,000 per brother, enough to make significant debt payments, invest in equipment upgrades, prove that specializing in seed corn had been the right decision. But seed corn required perfection. Any contamination from other corn varieties within a half-mile radius could ruin genetics. Any disease, any pest damage, any stress that reduced vigor would drop germination rates below contract minimums. DeKalb would reject the entire crop if quality standards weren't met. There was no middle ground, no partial payments for partial success. Either the corn met specifications or the contract was void. The brothers would be left selling their premium seed corn as regular grain corn, getting maybe $3 per bushel instead of the contracted premium. The financial difference between success and failure was approximately $250,000. With that money, the farm survived, expanded, continued. Without it, bankruptcy became likely within 18 months. The brothers had prepared meticulously for the '78 season. They'd tested soil in every field, adjusted fertilizer applications to precise specifications. They'd calibrated planters to place seeds at exact depths and spacing. They'd monitored weather constantly, irrigated when rainfall fell short, controlled weeds with herbicide applications timed to the hour. By early August, the crop looked perfect. Corn stood 8 feet tall, ears filled completely, silks browning right on schedule. Harvest was projected for late August, with testing and delivery to DeKalb by mid-September. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Robert walked fields every evening, sometimes taking his nephew Robert James with him, teaching the 16-year-old to read crop health by color, by leaf angle, by the sound stalks made in the wind. "This is what a perfect crop looks like," Robert would say. "This is what your great-great-grandfather dreamed of when he broke this prairie. This is why we do what we do." The boy would nod, understanding he was being initiated into something larger than agriculture. He was learning legacy. James maintained equipment with obsessive care, knowing that one breakdown during harvest could delay everything, could expose the crop to early frost or rain that would drop quality below contract standards. He had 3 combines serviced and ready, backup parts for every critical system, relationships with dealers who would deliver emergency parts within hours if needed. Thomas had negotiated with grain elevators, confirmed drying capacity, arranged for immediate testing once harvest began. He'd reviewed the DeKalb contract repeatedly, understood every specification, every deadline, every contingency. The crop represented 5 months of careful work by 3 brothers and 14 hired workers. Planting had occurred May 15th through May 22nd, using 4 12-row planters running 16-hour days. Cultivation happened in June, keeping weeds suppressed during critical growth periods. Irrigation ran through July's dry spell, pumping water from the Mackinaw River to maintain soil moisture. Every decision, every action, every dollar spent had been aimed at producing one outcome: a perfect crop that met DeKalb standards and secured the farm's future. By August 1st, the brothers allowed themselves to feel confident. Barring catastrophe, they were going to succeed. The corn was that good. The timing was perfect. Weather forecasts showed clear conditions through harvest. Nothing could stop them now. They'd beaten the odds, outsmarted the economy, proved that knowledge and hard work still mattered in modern agriculture. The Henley name would continue on this land. The legacy would pass to the next generation intact. Everything their great-grandfather had started in 1878 would survive another 100 years. That confidence lasted exactly 4 days. On August 4th, at 6:30 in the morning, Robert discovered standing water in the southeast 40 acres. The irrigation system had been left running all night, drowning corn in soil saturated beyond capacity. Corn roots can't breathe in waterlogged soil. The crop in that section was damaged, possibly fatally. Robert stood in the field, water over his boots, staring at corn that was already showing stress. His first thought was equipment failure. His second thought was human error. His third thought, the one that took root and grew, was that someone had done this deliberately. Robert walked back to the equipment barn where irrigation controls were located, found the system still running full pressure, pumping water that was now simply flooding the field rather than sustaining crops. He shut it down, checked the timer mechanism. It was set correctly, should have turned off at midnight. But someone had flipped a manual override switch, forcing the system to run continuously. Robert stared at that switch, trying to understand. Equipment didn't flip its own switches. Someone had been here, had deliberately overridden the automatic system, had left water running for at least 7 hours based on when he'd checked it the previous night. He found James in the main equipment barn, told him what he'd discovered. James went immediately to check the irrigation controls, confirmed what Robert had found. This wasn't equipment failure. This was human action. "Deliberate?" James asked. Robert nodded slowly. Had to be. James's face hardened. Who? Don't know yet. But we're going to find out. They called Thomas, who drove over from his house, walked the flooded field with his brothers, assessed the damage. 40 acres compromised. At $960 per acre, that was $38,400 in potential revenue, gone. If the corn recovered, maybe they'd lose only half that. If it didn't recover, if DeKalb rejected those acres, the entire 40 acres would be worth maybe $4,000 sold as grain corn. A $34,000 loss from one night of flooding. Thomas looked at his brothers. We need to talk to Miguel, get the whole crew together. Find out what happened. They gathered the workers at 8 a.m., all 14 men standing in the morning sun while Robert explained the problem. Someone left irrigation running all night. Southeast 40 is flooded. We need to know who was in the equipment barn last night. Miguel translated for the Spanish speakers, then answered in English. Nobody from our crew was in that barn after work yesterday. We finished at 7, cleaned up, ate dinner. Nobody went back out. You sure about that? Robert's voice was controlled, but tension showed in his shoulders. Miguel held his gaze. I'm sure. We were all together until dark. Then we were in the bunk barn. Nobody left. David Parker spoke up. I was last one to check irrigation yesterday evening, around 8. Everything was set right. Timer working, override switch in auto position. I made sure. So between 8 last night and 6:30 this morning, someone flipped that override? Thomas asked. And you're all saying it. Wasn't any of you? The workers looked at each other, confused, sensing accusation in the questions. Nobody had been near the irrigation controls. Several confirmed they'd been in the bunk barn all evening, playing cards, writing letters home, sleeping. The brothers conferred quietly. Either the workers were lying or something else had happened. But what else made sense? Equipment didn't sabotage itself. Robert dismissed the crew, told them to start normal work. As the men dispersed, he turned to his brothers. This doesn't feel right. Agreed, James said. But we can't ignore it either. That 40 acres might cost us the whole contract. They spent the day trying to salvage the flooded section, running pumps to remove excess water, aerating soil where possible. The corn showed stress but wasn't dead yet. Maybe, with time and luck, it would recover enough to meet contract standards. Maybe this was just bad luck, a one-time accident, something they could overcome. Then August 6th arrived, and they discovered the second problem. Thomas was checking the north fields that morning when he noticed color variation in the corn. Certain sections showed yellowing that shouldn't be there. He pulled a plant, examined the roots, recognized the symptoms immediately. Chemical burn, wrong herbicide mixture, or wrong timing had damaged these acres. He called James, who confirmed the diagnosis. Someone had applied a post-emergence herbicide after the corn was too mature to tolerate it. The timing was wrong by 3 weeks, and the concentration was wrong by a factor of 2. 80 acres affected. At $960 per acre, that was another $76,800 at risk. James checked the chemical application records, found entries that showed correct mixtures and timing. But the corn didn't lie. It had been hit with the wrong chemicals at the wrong time. The records were either false or had been followed incorrectly. Either way, someone had made a catastrophic mistake. Or not a mistake, Thomas said quietly. What if someone did this deliberately? Robert and James looked at him. That's a serious accusation, Robert said. I know, Thomas replied. But we've got 40 acres flooded and 80 acres chemically burned in less than 3 days. That's 120 acres damaged. That's 1/3 of our contract crop. That's $115,000 at risk. We can't pretend this is just bad luck. That evening, August 6th, the brothers confronted the crew again. This time the meeting was tenser, accusations more direct. Someone applied the wrong chemicals to the north fields. Someone either didn't follow the schedule or deliberately used the wrong mixture. We need answers. Miguel defended his crew, insisted they'd followed all instructions exactly as given. If chemicals were wrong, then the mixtures provided were wrong. His crew had only applied what they were told to apply. The confrontation ended without resolution, both sides frustrated, suspicious, unable to prove anything. August 7th brought the third incident. James discovered harvesting equipment sitting in the main barn with the motor seized. A corn head, the attachment that actually picks and shells the corn, had been left running without engagement, motor screaming at full RPM for hours, until it overheated and destroyed itself. The damage required a complete engine rebuild, parts that would take a week to arrive, labor that would cost $8,000. More importantly, it reduced their harvest capacity by 1/3, right when they needed maximum efficiency. James examined the equipment carefully, looking for mechanical explanations. He found none. The corn head had been parked correctly the previous evening. Someone had started it that morning, disengaged the cutting mechanism, and let the motor run at full throttle. The engine had oil, had fuel, had no mechanical reason to fail, except being run at damaging RPM for an extended period. Deliberate, James said flatly when his brothers arrived. No other explanation. Who? Robert asked. James shook his head. Don't know. But 3 major problems in 4 days? That's not coincidence, that's a pattern. Thomas did the math aloud. 40 acres flooded, 80 acres chemically burned, 1 corn head destroyed. We're looking at over $125,000 in damage so far. If this continues, we lose the contract. We lose everything. They called the workers together again. But this time the meeting happened in the equipment barn, with all 3 brothers standing together, presenting a united front. The workers gathered, sensing the changed atmosphere, the barely controlled anger radiating from the brothers. Robert spoke first, his voice tight with controlled fury. 3 major incidents in 4 days. Irrigation left running, chemicals applied wrong, equipment destroyed. We want to know who's responsible. Miguel stepped forward, his own frustration showing. We've told you, nobody from this crew has done anything wrong. We follow instructions. We do our jobs. If equipment fails, if chemicals are wrong, that's not our fault. You think we want this crop to fail? We don't get paid if you don't get paid. James cut in. Then explain how 3 different systems failed in 3 different ways in 4 days. Explain how irrigation got turned on manually. Explain how chemicals got mixed wrong when the schedule was clear. Explain how a corn head got left running until it destroyed itself. Miguel spread his hands. I can't explain what I didn't see. But I can tell you my crew didn't do these things. Maybe your equipment is old. Maybe your systems are failing. Maybe you need to look at your own operations before accusing us. The words hung in the humid air of the barn. Accusation met with counter-accusation, both sides certain of their righteousness, both sides unable to prove anything. David Parker spoke up, trying to mediate. Maybe we should check all equipment together, all of us. Make sure everything's working right. Set up watches so we know who's where when. That way nobody can be accused. Thomas shook his head. Too late for that. Damage is already done. We need to know who's responsible. Miguel's voice hardened. You want to blame someone? Blame us. Fire us. Send us away. But don't stand there calling us saboteurs when you have no proof. We came here to work, to earn money for our families. We've done nothing wrong. The meeting ended with both sides more convinced of betrayal, more certain the other group was lying, more entrenched in positions that allowed no compromise. The workers returned to the bunk barn, talking among themselves, worried that they'd be fired, that they'd lose weeks of wages, that the accusations would follow them to other farms. The brothers stood in the equipment barn after the workers left, trying to process what was happening. Robert spoke first. They're lying. Has to be. Equipment doesn't fail this way naturally. James nodded. But which ones? All of them? Just a few? How do we prove it? Thomas paced, calculating. If we lose another 100 acres, the contract's gone. DeKalb won't accept substandard corn. We'll be left selling everything as grain at regular prices, $3 per bushel instead of the premium. We'll gross maybe 100,000 instead of 384,000. We can't make our debt payments with that. The bank will foreclose. Robert's jaw tightened. So what do we do? Thomas stopped pacing, looked at his brothers. We watch them every minute. We document everything. And if we catch them sabotaging, we press charges. We make sure everyone knows what they did, James added, and we secure everything. No access to equipment without supervision. No unsupervised work. We treat them like what they are, threats to this farm. The decision made, the brothers split up to begin implementing security measures. They didn't discuss what would happen if the sabotage continued despite their precautions. They didn't articulate the rage building in their chests, the sense that their life's work was being destroyed by people they'd trusted, people they'd treated fairly. They simply acted, trying to protect what remained of their crop, their contract, their future. August 8th brought no new incidents, but the damage from previous days became clearer as the brothers assessed their situation. Robert spent the morning walking the flooded 40 acres, examining corn that showed increasing stress. Leaves were yellowing, stalks were weakening, ears weren't filling properly. Even if the corn survived, it wouldn't meet DeKalb germination standards. Those 40 acres were effectively lost. 40 times $960 equaled $38,400 gone. James examined the chemically burned 80 acres, reached the same conclusion. The herbicide damage was too severe. Corn was still growing, but at reduced vigor. Seed quality would be compromised. Another 80 acres lost. $76,800 gone. The destroyed corn head would cost $8,000 to repair and created a timing problem. Harvest needed to begin by August 25th to hit delivery deadlines. With one corn head down for repairs, they'd need 10 days instead of 7 to harvest 400 acres. That pushed them dangerously close to deadline, left no margin for weather delays or additional equipment problems. Thomas met with their accountant that afternoon, reviewed the numbers with brutal honesty. Original projection $308,000 net from 400 acres. Current reality, 120 acres compromised, leaving 280 acres of viable crop. 280 acres times $960 equaled $268,800 gross. Subtract production costs for all 400 acres, because those costs had already been incurred regardless of which acres produced quality corn, left approximately $190,000 net. Split 3 ways, $63,000 per brother. Barely enough to make minimum debt payments, with nothing left for living expenses, equipment maintenance, or the unexpected costs that always appeared. But that assumed the remaining 280 acres produced perfect corn that met all contract specifications. If additional problems occurred, if quality dropped even slightly, if DeKalb found any reason to reject additional acres, the numbers collapsed completely. And they still had 17 days until harvest began. 17 days when additional sabotage could occur. 17 days of vulnerability. The accountant, a man named Harold Perkins, who'd served 3 generations of Henley farmers, put down his calculator and looked at Thomas with sympathy that made everything worse. Tom, I'm going to be straight with you. If you lose any more acres, the bank's going to call your note. They're already nervous about farm loans. They're watching everyone's production numbers. You come in under $250,000 gross, they'll consider you a default risk. Thomas nodded, face blank. What happens then? Perkins sighed. They'll demand immediate payment of the balloon note. $210,000 due October 1st. If you can't pay, and you won't be able to without this crop succeeding, they'll foreclose. You'll lose the farm. Everything. Thomas stood, shook Perkins's hand, drove back to the farm in silence. That evening, the 3 brothers sat at Robert's kitchen table, the same table where their father had sat, where their grandfather had sat, planning seasons and calculating futures. Robert laid out what he'd found in the flooded acres. James reported on the chemical damage. Thomas explained the financial situation. The numbers were clear. They needed the remaining 280 acres to produce perfectly. Any additional loss meant bankruptcy. The farm their great-grandfather had claimed in 1878 would be sold at auction, probably to a corporate operation that would fold it into a larger holding. The Henley name would disappear from land it had occupied for 100 years. Robert spoke first. We can't let that happen. James nodded. So what do we do? The workers won't admit anything. We can't prove sabotage, but we can't ignore it either. Thomas pulled out a legal pad, started writing. We document everything. We photograph the damage. We get expert opinions on whether this could be accidental. We build a case. James looked at him. For what? For after, Thomas said. After the crop fails or succeeds, we'll know who's responsible. We'll have evidence. We'll make sure they pay for what they've done. Robert stood, walked to the window, looked out at darkening fields. What if documentation isn't enough? What if they destroy us and walk away clean? The question hung in the air. None of them answered it directly, but all of them felt the weight of it. They were watching their legacy die, watching 100 years of family labor evaporate because men they'd hired and trusted had, in their minds, chosen to destroy rather than build. The betrayal felt personal, intimate, unforgivable. They'd offered fair wages, decent housing, respectful treatment. In return, they'd received sabotage that threatened to erase everything their family had created. The meeting ended without resolution. The brothers agreed to continue heightened security, to watch the workers constantly, to protect what remained of their crop. But underneath the practical planning, something darker was growing. A sense that the legal system, that normal channels of justice, wouldn't be enough. That if the workers succeeded in destroying the farm, if the Henley legacy ended because of deliberate sabotage, then some other form of accounting would be required. They didn't articulate this thought explicitly, didn't acknowledge what they were beginning to contemplate. But it was there, in the silence between words, in the set of their jaws, in the way they looked at fields that represented everything they were. August 9th passed without incident, but the brothers found no comfort in the silence. They'd implemented security measures, rotation schedules that kept at least one brother on the property at all times, watching, documenting, waiting for the next disaster. The workers moved through their tasks with visible tension, aware they were being observed constantly, aware that every action was suspect. Miguel tried to maintain crew morale, but the atmosphere had poisoned. Men who'd worked together smoothly now second-guessed each other, wondered if accusations might be true, if someone among them was deliberately destroying the crop. David Parker approached Robert on August 10th, asked if they could talk privately. They walked to the edge of a field, far enough from others that conversation wouldn't be overheard. Mr. Henley, David said, his young face serious, I don't think anyone's sabotaging anything. I think maybe equipment's just failing. Old systems breaking down. Robert studied the 19-year-old, saw genuine belief, genuine desire to find reasonable explanations. Son, 3 different systems, failed in 3 different ways in 4 days. That's not coincidence. But what if it is? David pressed. What if we're looking for sabotage when there isn't any? What if we're accusing innocent people? Robert's face hardened. And what if they're destroying everything my family built? What if they're stealing our future and lying about it? What would you have me do? Nothing? David had no answer. He walked away troubled, sensing something dangerous building, unable to articulate what or how to stop it. That night, August 10th, the 3 brothers met again at Robert's kitchen table. It was past 11, the house quiet, Linda already asleep upstairs. They sat with coffee growing cold, discussing options that seemed increasingly limited. James spoke first. We've got 15 days until harvest. If nothing else happens, we might salvage enough to survive. barely, but survive. If anything else goes wrong, we're finished. Thomas added the financial reality. Bank payment due October 1st, $63,000 minimum. We hit that or we default. Contract delivery deadline September 20th. We miss that, DeKalb cancels everything. We've got no margin left. None. Robert stared at his coffee. They're going to hit us again. You know they are. They've cost us 120 acres already. Why stop now? Maybe because we're watching them now, James offered. Maybe the security measures are working. Robert shook his head. Or maybe they're waiting, being patient, planning something bigger. The three men sat in silence, each processing their situation through the lens of their different skills. James thinking about equipment vulnerability. What could still be sabotaged, despite security? Thomas calculating financial scenarios, trying to find a path that didn't end in foreclosure. Robert thinking about legacy, about responsibility to ancestors and descendants, about what a man does when everything he values is threatened. Finally, Thomas spoke quietly. If they succeed, if they destroy this farm, what happens to them? They collect their wages and move on to the next farm? They go home to Mexico with money in their pockets while we lose everything? James looked up. What are you saying? Thomas met his eyes. I'm saying the law won't help us. We can't prove sabotage, even though we know it's happening. Insurance won't cover it because it's not weather or fire, it's intentional damage. The bank doesn't care why we fail, only that we do. So if we lose everything, they walk away clean. Robert's voice was barely above a whisper. Our great-grandfather fought in the Civil War, came home and built this place from nothing. Survived droughts, depressions, wars, everything the world threw at him. Passed it to his son, who kept it going through hell itself. Passed it to our father, who expanded it, made it better. Now we're supposed to let some hired hands destroy it. Supposed to just accept that? James shifted uncomfortably. What's the alternative? The question hung between them, heavy with implications. None of them wanted to examine directly. They were farming men, church-going men, men who believed in law and order and proper ways of doing things. But they were also men who'd been raised on stories of frontier justice, of times when law was distant and unreliable, when men settled their own disputes because no one else would. They were men who understood that in rural communities, reputation and legacy mattered more than legal abstractions. They were men who'd served in wars, who'd seen that sometimes violence was the only language certain situations understood. Robert stood, walked to the window, looked out at darkness that hid his fields. His reflection in the glass showed a man aged beyond his 52 years, worn down by work and worry, and the sense that everything he'd fought for was slipping away. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, become something harder, colder. We need to think about worst case. If the crop fails, if we lose the farm, we need to make sure people know why. Make sure there are consequences. Thomas and James exchanged glances. Neither asked for clarification. They understood subtext, understood that their eldest brother was suggesting something that couldn't be said explicitly. The meeting ended shortly after midnight. No decisions were made, no plans articulated. But something had shifted in that kitchen. Some boundary had been approached, if not yet crossed. The brothers separated to their homes, each carrying thoughts they didn't fully acknowledge, even to themselves. Thoughts about justice and revenge, about protection and punishment, about what men do when systems fail them, and everything they value hangs in the balance. August 11th dawned clear and hot, temperature climbing toward 90 degrees by noon. The workers went through their routines, under constant supervision, feeling the weight of suspicion, resenting it but unable to change it. Miguel continued trying to maintain professionalism, but even he was starting to crack under the pressure. That evening, he approached Robert one final time, tried to bridge the gap that had opened between employer and employees. "Mr. Henley, we need to clear the air. This suspicion, it's poisoning everything. We've worked hard for you. We want this crop to succeed as much as you do." Robert looked at him, face unreadable. "Do you, Miguel? Because from where I stand, it looks like someone's trying to destroy us, and your crew's the only people with access and opportunity." Miguel's frustration finally broke through. "You think we'd risk our reputations? Risk never working again? For what? We make more money if your crop succeeds. We have no reason to sabotage. Unless someone's paying you to," Robert said flatly. "Unless you're working for a competitor, or unless you're trying to extort more money from us." Miguel stepped back like he'd been slapped. "That's what you think? That we're criminals?" Robert didn't answer, just turned and walked away, leaving Miguel standing in the August heat, realizing that no amount of denial would change what the brothers had decided to believe. That night, Miguel gathered his crew, told them about the conversation. The workers argued about whether they should quit, leave before the situation deteriorated further. But they'd invested 7 weeks of work, thousands of dollars in wages they couldn't afford to forfeit. They decided to stay, finish the job, collect their pay, and never return to the Henley farm. August 12th fell on a Saturday, 13 days before harvest was scheduled to begin. The morning started like any other that week, workers arriving at 6 a.m. to begin tasks under watchful supervision, brothers maintaining their security rotation, everyone moving through routines that had become mechanical, drained of any cooperation or trust. The temperature climbed steadily, reaching 88 degrees by 10 a.m., heading toward 95 by afternoon. Humidity made the air thick enough to chew, made every movement feel like pushing through water. The corn stood at full height, ears fully developed, ready for the final 2 weeks of maturation before harvest. Robert walked the fields at midday, checking moisture levels, looking for any signs of new problems. The remaining 280 viable acres looked as perfect as corn could look. Heavy ears, healthy stalks, color exactly right. If nothing else went wrong, if they could just maintain this for 13 more days, they might survive. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it brought only tension, the waiting for the next catastrophe that felt inevitable. James spent the day in the equipment barn working on the damaged corn head, trying to accelerate repairs that were supposed to take a week. He'd sourced parts from 3 different suppliers, was rebuilding the engine himself rather than waiting for the dealer's mechanic. He worked with silent intensity, hands moving with practiced precision, mind focused on the technical problems in front of him. because thinking about anything else led to darkness he wasn't ready to examine. Thomas drove to Bloomington that morning, met with the bank, tried to get an extension on their October payment. The loan officer, a man named Richard Paulson, who'd gone to high school with Thomas, listened sympathetically but shook his head. "Tom, I wish I could help, but the bank's under pressure from regulators. We're supposed to be tightening standards, reducing risk. I can't extend your note without seeing better numbers than what you're projecting." "What if we bring in a full crop?" Thomas asked. "What if the remaining acres produce perfectly?" Paulson pulled out Thomas's file, reviewed numbers. "If you hit full contract value on 280 acres, that's 268,000 gross, about 190 net. You can make your October payment with that, but you'll be living on nothing for 6 months until the next crop. One bad winter, one equipment breakdown, one unexpected expense, and you're finished anyway." Thomas drove back to the farm in silence, radio off, windows down despite the heat, trying to think through scenarios that all ended the same way. They were going to lose the farm. Maybe not in October, maybe not this year, but soon. Unless something changed dramatically, unless they found some way to recover what had been destroyed. The Henley legacy was ending. That realization settled in his chest like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe. By evening, the heat had peaked at 96 degrees, then slowly began declining as the sun dropped toward the western horizon. The workers finished their tasks at 6:30, washed up at the outdoor pump, gathered in the bunk barn for dinner. Someone had driven to Lexington, brought back fried chicken and potato salad from the grocery store. The men ate quietly, tension still present but muted by exhaustion and heat. Miguel used the barn's payphone to call home, spoke to his wife Rosa for 15 minutes, told her he'd be home in 3 weeks, that the money would come as soon as the crop was harvested and sold. He didn't mention the accusations, the poisoned atmosphere, the sense that something was fundamentally wrong beyond normal employer-employee friction. David Parker wrote a letter to his girlfriend at Illinois State, describing the farm work but omitting the conflict. He wrote about the satisfaction of physical labor, about understanding agriculture from the ground up, about plans for when he'd return to campus in 2 weeks. He didn't write about the looks the Henley brothers gave the workers, about the accusations he'd witnessed, about the growing fear he felt but couldn't justify with concrete evidence. Carlos Mendoza played cards with Roberto Sanchez and Jesus Hernandez, betting small amounts, trying to maintain normalcy. Francisco Torres read a Spanish Bible, lips moving silently through familiar verses. The local workers, Terry Jameson, Mark Sullivan, Kevin Richards, Daniel Whitmore, Christopher Hayes, and James Morrison, sat together near the barn's west wall talking about sports, about the Cardinals' chances at the playoffs, about anything except the tension that surrounded them. By 10 p.m., most of the workers had settled in for sleep. The barn had been converted with 14 beds, 7 along each wall, with the center space left open. Not luxurious, but functional. Better than sleeping in fields or vehicles like some crews did. The building was solid, built in 1932, when the Henley grandfather had expanded operations. Post and beam construction Oak timbers that would last another century, metal roof that kept rain out and held heat in, 2 windows on the east wall, 1 door on the north end, electricity running to overhead lights and outlets. Miguel was the last to bed, finishing a letter to his brother in Mexico. He sealed the envelope, addressed it, set it on the small table near his bed to mail Monday. He turned out the main lights at 11:47, leaving only the exit sign glowing above the door. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 68 degrees. A slight breeze moved through the corn, making the stalks rustle with a sound like whispered conversations. The sky was clear, stars visible despite light pollution from Bloomington 20 miles south. In the farmhouse 400 yards away, Robert Henley sat at his kitchen table, unable to sleep, staring at financial records that told the story of impending failure. James was in the equipment barn, still working on the cornhead engine, hands moving automatically while his mind worked through darker thoughts. Thomas sat on his porch, smoking a cigarette, watching the bunk barn where a single light glowed, then went dark at 11:47. At 2:23 a.m. on August 13th, smoke began rising from the northeast corner of the bunk barn. The fire started small, fed initially by gasoline that had been poured along the barn's exterior wall, soaking into old wood that had dried over 46 summers. The flames found purchase in the weathered boards, climbed quickly toward the roof, spread laterally along the wall. Inside, 14 men slept, exhausted from the day's labor, unaware that their lives were measured now in minutes. The smoke entered first, seeping through gaps in the walls, rising to collect against the metal roof before slowly descending. Smoke inhalation would later prove to be the actual cause of death for 11 of the 14 victims. Their lungs filled with carbon monoxide and toxic fumes before flames ever touched them. They died in their sleep, without waking, without knowing what was happening. 3 workers woke as smoke thickened and heat increased. Miguel Angel Ruiz, always a light sleeper, came alert when he smelled smoke, saw the orange glow through the barn's east windows. He shouted, waking David Parker and Mark Sullivan, who were nearest to him. The 3 men stumbled through thickening smoke toward the barn's only door, the north entrance they'd used every day for 7 weeks. Miguel reached it first, grabbed the handle, pulled. The door didn't move. He pulled harder, putting his weight into it, beginning to panic as smoke made breathing difficult. The door remained closed. It had been secured from the outside. A chain had been wrapped through the door handle and around a support post, held with a padlock that wouldn't yield to desperate pulling. Miguel screamed, pounded on the door, hoping someone outside would hear, would come to investigate, would release the chain. Behind him, David and Mark joined, all 3 men shouting, hitting the door, feeling heat increasing as fire consumed the barn's structure. The fire spread with terrible speed through the old wooden building. Dry timber that had supported the barn for 4 decades became fuel. Flames racing along support beams, climbing posts, consuming everything flammable. The metal roof held initially, trapping heat inside, turning the barn into an oven. Temperature inside climbed past 100 degrees, past 200, past 300. The 3 conscious men at the door felt their skin blistering, their lungs burning from superheated air and smoke. Miguel made one final attempt to break through the door, threw his shoulder against it with everything he had. The door flexed but held. The chain was stronger than flesh, stronger than desperation. Behind them, the 11 other workers never woke. Carbon monoxide poisoning had already rendered them unconscious, then dead. Their bodies lay on the beds where they'd fallen asleep, unaware that morning would never come, that the money they'd worked for would never be sent home, that families waiting in Jalisco and Illinois would soon receive news that would shatter them. At 2:58 a.m., the barn's roof began collapsing. Support beams consumed by fire gave way. Metal roofing crashed inward, bringing flames down onto the bodies below. The 3 men at the door had stopped moving by then, overcome by smoke and heat, collapsed against the door they couldn't open. At 3:10 a.m., a driver on Route 150, 3 miles away, saw flames lighting the sky, called the Lexington Volunteer Fire Department from a gas station payphone. The call reached the fire station at 3:14. Volunteers were dispatched at 3:17. The first truck arrived at the Henley farm at 3:32, exactly 69 minutes after the fire had started. By then, the barn was fully engulfed, roof completely collapsed, walls falling inward. Firefighters could do nothing but contain the blaze, prevent it from spreading to other structures. They pumped water from the farm pond, soaked surrounding ground, saved the main equipment barn 100 feet away. But the bunk barn was already lost, and everyone inside it. Robert Henley appeared at 3:40, coming from the farmhouse in pants and t-shirt, no shoes, looking confused and horrified. He stood next to the fire chief, watching flames consume the barn, watching 46 years of structure reduced to ash and twisted metal. "Where are the workers?" Robert asked. "Were they in there?" The fire chief looked at him. "This is the bunk barn, right? Where your crew sleeps?" Robert nodded, face blank. "Then yeah, they're in there. Unless they got out before we arrived." "Did you see anyone get out?" Robert shook his head slowly. "I was asleep. Fire woke me. I didn't see anyone." James and Thomas arrived minutes later, stood with their brother, watching the barn burn. The fire chief asked standard questions. When did they notice the fire? Had anyone been smoking near the barn? Were there any electrical problems? The brothers answered mechanically, saying they'd been asleep, hadn't noticed anything until the fire was already large, didn't know about any electrical issues. The fire burned through the night, finally dying to embers by 5:30 a.m., as the first hint of dawn showed in the eastern sky. By 6 a.m., fire investigators were examining the ruins, quickly finding evidence that would change everything. The chain on the door, still wrapped around the support post, padlock intact. The smell of gasoline, distinct even among the general reek of burned wood and flesh. The pore pattern along the exterior wall, showing where accelerant had been applied. By 7 a.m., the Lexington police chief was on site. By 8 a.m., Illinois State Police had been called. By 9 a.m., the fire was officially classified as arson and mass murder. By 10 a.m., the 3 Henley brothers were being questioned separately, their stories compared, their alibis checked, their access to gasoline and chains documented. The Illinois State Police arrived in force by midday August 13th, turning the Henley farm into a crime scene. Yellow tape surrounded the burned barn's remains. Photographers documented everything. Evidence technicians collected samples. Investigators began the grim work of cataloging 14 bodies burned beyond easy identification. Lead investigator was Detective Sergeant William Morrison, 38 years old, 12 years with the state police, experienced in arson investigations, but never in anything approaching this scale. He'd worked house fires, vehicle arsons, insurance fraud cases. He'd never worked a mass murder by fire. Morrison walked the scene methodically, noting details, forming theories. The chain and padlock on the door were the most damning evidence. No accident, no electrical fire, no unfortunate tragedy could explain why the only exit had been secured from outside. Someone had deliberately trapped 14 men inside a building, then set that building on fire. Premeditated murder multiplied by 14 counts. The gasoline pour pattern was clear once debris was cleared. Someone had walked along the barn's northeast corner, pouring accelerant, creating a line of fuel that would ensure rapid spread once ignited. Empty gas cans were found in the equipment barn, 3 5-gallon containers that smelled of gasoline, that showed fresh purchase dates from the Lexington service station. Receipts in the farm office confirmed purchases. Robert Henley had bought 15 gallons of gas on August 11th, 2 days before the fire. When asked, Robert explained they needed gas for small equipment, generators, mowers. Nothing unusual about having gas on a farm. Morrison separated the 3 brothers, questioned each individually, looking for inconsistencies in their stories. All 3 claimed they'd been asleep when the fire started, had been woken by the sound of sirens or the smell of smoke, had rushed out to find the barn already engulfed. None claimed to have seen or heard anything before the fire was well established. "Where were you at 2:30 this morning?" Morrison asked Robert. "In bed, asleep. My wife can confirm it. Did you wake when the fire started?" "Not at first. I sleep heavy. Linda woke me when she heard sirens." "You didn't smell smoke before that?" "Our bedroom faces west. Barn's to the east. Wouldn't have smelled it until it was pretty far along." The story was plausible but unverifiable. Linda Henley confirmed her husband had been in bed, but she'd been asleep herself until sirens woke her. She couldn't say for certain Robert hadn't left the room briefly. Couldn't provide an unbreakable alibi. James Henley's story was similar. He'd been asleep in his house on the property's northwest corner. Lived alone. No one to verify his whereabouts. Said he woke to sirens, got dressed, drove to the main area, found the barn already burning. Thomas Henley had been home with his wife Mary and their 2 sons. Mary confirmed Thomas had been in bed, but again she'd been asleep. Couldn't swear he hadn't left briefly, couldn't provide absolute certainty. Morrison pressed each brother about relationships with the workers. Had there been conflicts? Any threats? Any reason someone might target the crew? All 3 brothers mentioned the crop damage, the incidents over the past week, their suspicion that workers had been sabotaging operations. Robert was most vocal about it. "We thought they were destroying our crop deliberately, trying to extort more money or working for a competitor." We'd confronted them about it. There was tension. Morrison asked the critical question, "Did you consider firing them?" Robert shook his head. "Couldn't afford to. needed them to finish the harvest. We were planning to deal with it after the season ended, pursue legal action if we could prove sabotage. So you had motive to be angry with them? Morrison suggested. Angry enough to kill 14 people? Robert's face hardened. We're farmers, Detective. We're not murderers. We wanted justice, not revenge. We wanted proof, not blood. By evening, August 13th, Morrison had a working theory. The brothers believed their workers had sabotaged their crop. The financial pressure was documented. The potential bankruptcy was real. If the brothers concluded the workers would destroy them and face no consequences, if desperation and anger overcame reason, if they decided frontier justice was their only option, then the fire made terrible sense. Trap the workers in the barn, eliminate the threat, claim it was an accident or that the workers had done it to themselves. The theory had problems. No witnesses saw the brothers near the barn between midnight and 3 a.m. No physical evidence placed them at the scene when the fire started. The gasoline purchase was suspicious, but not conclusive, legitimate on a working farm. The chain and padlock couldn't be traced definitively to the brothers, though they had similar equipment in their shops. Morrison knew he had enough to arrest based on motive and opportunity, but building a prosecution case that would survive trial would require more evidence, more certainty. On August 14th, Morrison obtained search warrants, went through the brothers' homes, vehicles, outbuildings, found more chains and padlocks, similar to the one used on the barn but not identical, found receipts for gasoline purchases normal for a farm, found financial records showing desperate economic situation, confirming motive, found no smoking gun, no confession, no definitive proof. On August 15th, after consulting with the McLean County State's attorney, Morrison arrested all 3 Henley brothers, charged each with 14 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of arson, and conspiracy to commit murder. Bond was set at $1 million each, ensuring they'd remain in custody pending trial. The arrests shocked McLean County. The Henleys were known families, respected farmers, men who'd never been in trouble with law enforcement. The idea that they could commit mass murder seemed impossible to neighbors who'd known them for decades. But the evidence, circumstantial as it was, pointed in only one direction: motive, opportunity, and access to materials used in the crime. No other suspects made sense. The investigation continued, but the case seemed clear. The trial of Robert, James, and Thomas Henley began March 5, 1979, in the McLean County Courthouse in Bloomington, Illinois. The prosecution was led by State's Attorney Douglas Mitchell, 43, who'd held the position for 8 years and never prosecuted a capital murder case, let alone one involving 14 victims. The defense consisted of 3 attorneys, one for each brother, but they coordinated strategy. Lead counsel was Martin Kruger, a prominent criminal defense attorney from Chicago who'd taken the case pro bono after receiving calls from farm advocacy groups who believed the brothers were being scapegoated. Jury selection took 2 weeks, complicated by the case's notoriety throughout central Illinois. Everyone had heard about the barn fire. Everyone had opinions. Finding 12 citizens who could set aside preconceptions proved nearly impossible. Eventually, a jury was seated. 8 men, 4 women, mostly rural residents who understood farming economics, who knew what desperation looked like, who could imagine the pressure the Henley brothers had faced. The prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence arranged into a compelling narrative. Mitchell presented financial records, showing the brothers were months from bankruptcy. He presented testimony about the crop damage, about confrontations between brothers and workers, about escalating tension. He brought the fire marshal who testified about the gasoline pour pattern, about the chain securing the door from outside, about the impossibility of this being accidental. He presented the gas purchase receipts, the timeline, the lack of alibis. Most powerfully, he presented the victims, photos of 14 men who died in the fire, testimony from family members who traveled from Mexico and from towns throughout Illinois. Miguel Ruiz's widow, Rosa, speaking through a translator, described her husband's last phone call, his promises to send money, his plans to return home. David Parker's mother, Dorothy, testified through tears about her son's dreams of studying agriculture, of helping farmers, of making the world better. The prosecution argued this wasn't just murder. It was elimination of witnesses to crop sabotage the brothers couldn't prove. It was revenge for economic damage. It was the ultimate expression of valuing property over human life. The defense strategy was bold. Kruger didn't deny the brothers had motive. He embraced it, argued they'd been victims of deliberate sabotage that threatened to destroy 4 generations of family legacy. But he insisted they'd never acted on that anger. The fire, Kruger argued, was set by the workers themselves. An accident involving smoking or cooking that got out of control. The chain on the door? Someone inside had secured it for privacy or security, not realizing it would trap them. The gasoline? Normal farm supply, not evidence of arson. The defense presented expert testimony suggesting the fire could have started from electrical malfunction or careless smoking. Presented character witnesses who testified the Henley brothers were peaceful men, church-going men, incapable of mass murder. Thomas's wife, Mary, testified her husband had been in bed all night. Linda Henley swore Robert never left their bedroom. The defense's closing argument focused on reasonable doubt. Yes, the brothers had motive. Yes, they'd purchased gasoline. But motive isn't evidence. Gasoline on a farm isn't suspicious. No witness placed them at the barn. No physical evidence connected them to the fire. The prosecution wants you to convict based on assumption, Kruger told the jury, based on the idea that desperate men must be guilty men, but America doesn't work that way. We require proof beyond reasonable doubt. The prosecution presented terrible tragedy, but they haven't proven who caused it. The jury deliberated for 6 days, longer than anyone expected. They requested evidence be brought to the jury room multiple times, asked for clarification on legal standards for circumstantial evidence, struggled with the weight of deciding whether 3 men would spend their lives in prison. On March 23, 1979, they returned verdicts. Guilty on all counts. All 3 brothers, 14 counts of first-degree murder each. Conspiracy. Arson. The courtroom erupted. Family members of victims wept with relief. The brothers sat, motionless, faces blank, processing the reality that their lives had ended. Sentencing occurred April 10, 1979. Judge Harold Williams, 61, a McLean County native who'd presided over the trial with careful attention to procedure, faced the 3 Henley brothers. Illinois law mandated life imprisonment for first-degree murder. With 14 counts each and conspiracy convictions, the brothers would never see freedom again. William sentenced each brother to 14 consecutive life terms, plus additional time for arson and conspiracy. Natural life without possibility of parole. Robert Allen Henley, age 53, would spend the rest of his life in Stateville Correctional Center. James Edward Henley, 49, would be imprisoned at Pontiac Correctional Center. Thomas Robert Henley, 46, would serve his sentence at Menard Correctional Center. The brothers were separated, sent to different maximum security prisons, denied the companionship that had defined their lives. For the families of the 14 victims, the verdicts brought no satisfaction, only the hollow confirmation that someone would be punished. Rosa Ruiz returned to Jalisco with the body of her husband Miguel, buried him in the village cemetery, raised 3 children alone on money sent by relatives who understood tragedy. David Parker's parents, William and Dorothy, closed their hardware store within a year, unable to face the community's sympathy, the constant reminders of the son who'd been weeks from starting college. They moved to Arizona, tried to rebuild lives that had been shattered. The families of the other 12 victims scattered across Illinois and Mexico, carrying grief that never fully healed, anger that had no outlet, loss that compounded across generations. Children grew up without fathers. Wives became widows. Parents buried sons. The ripple effects touched hundreds of people across 2 countries, creating voids that could never be filled, raising questions that had no satisfying answers. For the Henley families, the devastation was equally complete. Linda Henley divorced Robert in 1981, unable to reconcile the man she'd married with the man convicted of mass murder. She moved to Springfield, changed her name, spent the rest of her life trying to escape association with crimes that defined her in others' eyes. The 3 Henley daughters, Sarah, Rebecca, and Michelle, struggled with the stigma of being children of a convicted murderer. Sarah's husband divorced her, citing inability to handle the notoriety. Rebecca lost her teaching position when parents objected to having a murderer's daughter educating their children. Michelle attempted suicide in 1983, survived, spent years in therapy trying to process the disintegration of everything she'd believed about her father. James Henley, unmarried, had no immediate family to devastate, only nieces and nephews who learned to never mention their uncle. Thomas's wife Mary stayed in McLean County initially, trying to maintain normalcy for their sons, Robert James and Michael Thomas, but the boys were bullied mercilessly, called murderers' sons, attacked for crimes their father had committed. By 1982, Mary moved the family to Indiana, started over with new names, new identities, new stories about where they'd come from. The boys grew up never speaking about their father, never visiting him in prison, trying to build lives separate from the legacy of violence that had destroyed their childhood. The Henley farm was seized by the bank in October 1979, sold at auction for a fraction of its value. A corporate agriculture company purchased it, folded it into a larger operation, erased the family name from land it had occupied for 101 years. The farmhouse where 4 generations of Henleys had lived was demolished in 1985. The equipment barn was converted to grain storage. The site where the bunk barn had stood was left empty, nothing marking the spot where 14 men had died except absence, 46 years have passed since that August night in 1978. The Henley farm exists now only as geographic coordinates, 850 acres folded into a corporate holding that stretches across 12,000 acres of McLean County. The land produces corn still, 250 bushels per acre in good years, managed by GPS-guided equipment and monitored by satellite imagery. Young agronomists who work the fields have never heard the name Henley, don't know that 3 brothers once bet everything on this soil, don't know that 14 men died here over corn that grew anyway, indifferent to human tragedy. Robert Henley died in Stateville Correctional Center on December 2, 2009, age 84. Heart failure, complicated by decades of prison medical care that was adequate but never excellent. He'd served 31 years maintaining innocence until the end, writing letters to family members who stopped responding after the first decade. Prison records show he was a model inmate, caused no problems, worked in the library, kept to himself. He died alone in the prison infirmary, no family present, body claimed by the state, and buried in a prison cemetery downstate. James Henley died in Pontiac Correctional Center on August 7th, 2015, age 85. Complications from emphysema, lungs destroyed by decades of smoking and prison air quality. He'd served 36 years, longer than he'd lived as a free man. His death certificate listed no next of kin. His body was cremated, ashes scattered in accordance with state procedure for unclaimed remains. Thomas Henley died in Menard Correctional Center on March 14th, 2021, age 87, the last of the 3 brothers. Cancer, untreated until too advanced to cure, metastasized throughout his body. He'd served 42 years, outliving both brothers, dying during the COVID pandemic when prison populations were devastated by disease and isolation. His sons never visited, never wrote, never acknowledged his existence after 1982. McLean County changed dramatically in the decades after the Henley trial. Family farms that had dominated the landscape for a century were absorbed by corporate operations. By 2025, farms over 5,000 acres controlled 80% of McLean County agriculture. The small towns that had supported farm families, places like Lexington and Chinoa, shrank as young people left for cities. Churches closed, schools consolidated, main streets filled with empty storefronts. The economic pressures that had driven the Henley brothers to desperation never went away, only intensified, evolving into a system where family farms became increasingly impossible to maintain. The barn fire became local legend, a story told to illustrate the dangers of desperation, the tragedy of economic collapse, the thin line between civilization and violence. But the details faded with each retelling. By 2025, most county residents under 40 had never heard of the Henley brothers, didn't know about the barn fire, couldn't say why certain sections of farmland near Lexington felt somehow wrong, somehow heavy with history nobody remembered. There is no memorial in McLean County. No historical marker explains that on this ground, 14 men died and 3 brothers destroyed themselves over 400 acres of damaged corn. The county just moved on the way communities do, covering scars with layers of normalcy until they almost disappear. Children play in fields where Miguel Ruiz once walked, where David Parker dreamed of agricultural college, where 11 other men worked and died. Corn grows 8 feet tall every summer, indifferent to what the soil remembers, to the ash that once settled into dirt, to the blood that once soaked the ground. The question that haunts the Henley case 46 years later isn't whether the brothers committed mass murder. The jury decided that. The question is why desperate men chose to cross the boundary from victims to perpetrators, from farmers defending their legacy to killers destroying futures. What transforms economic pressure into lethal violence? Where is the line between protecting what you've built and becoming what you fear? No easy answers exist. The uncomfortable truth is that Robert, James, and Thomas Henley were both victims and victimizers simultaneously. They were men watching 4 generations of family labor evaporate, unable to prove the sabotage they believed was destroying them, failed by economic systems that valued corporate efficiency over family legacy, abandoned by a legal framework that couldn't protect intangible inheritance. But they were also men who chose murder, who planned the elimination of 14 human beings, who valued corn and legacy more than lives, who transformed their own victimhood into justification for atrocity. Both things are true. Captain Raymond Foster of Illinois State Police, who assisted in the investigation, said in a 2020 interview, "Legally, the Henley brothers were mass murderers. Morally, they were desperate men in a failed system. I've carried that contradiction for 42 years. Still don't have an answer. The truth about revenge is simple and terrible. It doesn't restore what was lost. It doesn't heal wounds or recover stolen futures. It only creates new loss, new wounds, new families destroyed." The Henley brothers eliminated 14 men, but couldn't eliminate their desperation, couldn't save their farm, couldn't protect their legacy. They defended their family name, but destroyed their family's future. In the end, what did their violence purchase? 3 life sentences, a farm lost anyway, children who grew up ashamed, a 100-year legacy erased more completely than any sabotage could have achieved. If this story made you think about desperation, legacy, and the price we pay when economic systems fail rural America, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about justice and revenge, about family and legacy, about how ordinary people become capable of extraordinary darkness when pushed beyond breaking points. Comment below. Where do you draw the line between protecting your legacy and destroying your humanity? What would you have done in the Henley brothers' position? Because these stories aren't just history. They're happening now in forgotten counties, where family farms still collapse, where economic pressure still crushes communities, where desperate people still face impossible choices between surrender and violence. The circumstances change, but the fundamental question remains: what are we willing to become to protect what we love? Until next time, remember, the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made one destroyed acre, one desperate calculation, one August night at a time. And the line between victim and perpetrator, between justice and vengeance, between protecting your legacy and destroying others' futures, that line isn't drawn in law books or moral philosophies. It's drawn in the human heart, where it's always been thinnest, always been easiest to cross, always been hardest to find our way back from. The Henley farm grows corn still, 250 bushels per acre, feeding a world that never knew 14 men died there, that 3 brothers chose murder over bankruptcy, that legacy became more valuable than life. The land remembers nothing, only we remember. And even that we're forgetting.